There we are. It says it's working. Okay. All right. So when last we met, we had our exciting story of the birth of the modern state of Israel. Yeah. So we finished in roughly 1948, a little bit after, because we talked about the first war of independence that Israel had to fight against all of the surrounding countries, and how at the very end, Israel was able to secure pretty good borders and was able to still exist, which is really good, because at the beginning it wasn't clear that Israel was going to make it. So Israel finally does make it out of that war. There is a ceasefire, and as we talked about where these ceasefire lines were, that became the new borders of Israel. Now, the parts that were originally designated by the United Nations to become Palestinian territories, what we now call the West Bank and Gaza Strip, those areas were absorbed by Jordan and by Egypt. So unfortunately, this was the second opportunity that there could have been an independent Palestinian state that was missed. Right? The first opportunity was they could have accepted the 1948 division according to the United Nations. They didn't. The second opportunity was after the war, when they realized that Israel was not going to go away, they could have accepted that they would have a state with what was left. And they didn't. Instead, like I said, Jordan occupies and takes over the territory we call the West Bank, and Egypt occupies and takes over the area that we call the Gaza Strip. Nobody complained. They stole the land that the UN had said belonged to the Palestinians. Nobody complained. Which is why in the modern world, when people complain about Israel being in those territories, it's like, what, for 20 some years, you had no problem with other people being there. But now that Israel is, it's the world's worst human rights violation. All right, so that's a problem. We're going to come back to how that eventually affects modern times. But first, we have to understand that during this time period, there were many, many refugees. Among the Palestinian people, we know that there were a few 100,000 Palestinians who left during the War of Independence, and they ended up settling in refugee camps, awaiting Israel's destruction so they can come back, which didn't happen. The part that a lot of people don't think about is that there was also a refugee crisis among Jews. We already talked a little bit about the refugees of World War II, those that were left in Europe that couldn't go home or didn't want to go back to the countries that had treated them so badly. And many of them were absorbed by Israel. But the Arab countries and the non-Arab, but also Muslim countries around the world began to push their Jews out. So if you were a Jew who was living, So if you were a Jewish person living in Morocco, if you were a Jewish person living in Iraq or Egypt, and your family had been there, I don't know, for 2,000 years, all of a sudden you were being told you have to go. And the numbers are quite shocking. Wow. So in 1948, these are the populations of the North African and Arab countries and the non-Arab Muslim countries as well. So as you can see, overall, there were about 1 million Jews throughout this part of the world. The Ashkenazic world in Europe was a larger Jewish population in total, but this area did have an awful lot of Jews who were living there. By 1972, the numbers have gone down a lot, on the order of anywhere from 700 to 800 or more thousand Jews were forced to leave the Arab countries because the Arab governments blamed them for Israel. This was the first real stirring of what would become a recurring pattern, which is all Jews in the world are considered to be responsible for Israel, and therefore people who don't like Israel decided they don't like Jews as well, which is why when people often will criticize Israel, you'll notice that sometimes that criticism of Israel is not only a criticism of policy, which you're absolutely free to criticize Israel's politics. I do it all the time because Israel's politics is a little crazy, but criticizing the politics is different than criticizing the people or the religion. But unfortunately, that was missed during this time period. And so Israel, who just had to fight a war to survive and who was already absorbing tens and thousands and hundreds of thousands of refugees from the Holocaust, is now getting an additional 700, 800, 900,000 people who are coming from these Arab countries that are also refugees. So in the first few years of Israel's life, it had to absorb well over 1 million refugees that came to Israel with nothing, right? With like a suitcase, and that was it. That is a pretty hard thing to handle when you're a country that is now doubling its population almost overnight. But the new double is not people coming with their businesses, not people coming with all of their assets, but people who are coming with nothing and saying, I need a place to live and I need food to eat. But Israel managed. Israel was able to absorb, and Israel is much stronger for it. However, it did create a bit of a tension. So the Ashkenazim, as I mentioned, is the term that we use for the European, is the post is in the way? Right. So the Ashkenazim is the term that's used for the European Jewish people. The Sephardim is the term that's used for people that are Jewish that come from either the Iberian Peninsula, that means Spain and Portugal, but not so many of them anymore because the Inquisition kicked them out in 1492, or they came from their descendants. So this is where it gets a little kind of weird. So for example, there are many Sephardim that come from Greece, many Sephardim that come from Turkey, because many of the people left Spain and went across the Mediterranean and ended up in Greece and Turkey. Many Sephardim went across to Morocco. Many Sephardim went to Algeria, Tunisia, and other parts of North Africa. Many Sephardim went up into Amsterdam, into Holland. So although they are now not in the geography of Sfarad, of Spain or Portugal, they are still called Sephardim because they follow that tradition of Judaism from that area. And then there is also what we call the Mizrahi Jews. And the Mizrahi are the people who came from Middle Eastern countries that were not from the Sephardic push. And there ends up being a lot of mix between these two, because as I said, many of the Sephardim, when they left Spain, ended up going to the Middle East, and they ended up mixing with the Jews who were already there. So you end up with kind of a blend of the cultures. Complicated, right? It's because there are Jews all over the world because we have been pushed all around. Okay. In Israel, from 1948 going onward, this creates a wonderful little dynamic, which is to say the two groups do not get along perfectly. Now, there's a reason for that, right? Why we have the tension. Well, most of the active Zionists were Ashkenazi. If you ever go back and you read a history of how the modern state of Israel was made, which we just skimmed over last time, you'll see that most of the immigrants that were coming were from places like Poland, Romania, Russia. They were Ashkenazim. If you read a list of the names of the people who were fighting for Israel's independence, most of the political and military leaders were all Ashkenazim. They were all from the European Jewish groups. And most of the financial support came from European or American Jewish communities. So in many ways, Israel was founded by Ashkenazim, even though there were Sephardim and Mizrahi who were living there in the land of Israel at the time. So the Ashkenazim sort of felt they were in charge, right? They built the country. They were the ones who were the politicians. They were the ones who had brought all the support. They were the ones who had gone to the UN and made all that happen. They were most of the generals. So of course they should be in charge. And you know, you guys are, well, you can come, but you're poor. You're uneducated by the Ashkenazic standards, by the European standards. So we'll take care of you, but just, you know, don't expect to be in charge of anything anytime soon. This was a problem. Because you can imagine that if you were to treat another group of people as though somehow they weren't quite ready to take care of themselves, they might get a little angry. And indeed, this caused a lot of tension. As I mentioned, the Ashkenazim, they were driven by the Enlightenment and the Haskalah. Remember, the early settlers of Israel at this time period were primarily secular. They were not very, very religious. They were very much taken by classical music and philosophy and literature and not so much Torah and not so much Jewish law. So they had that mindset, whereas most of the Middle Easterners they were coming all with their belief in Torah, their belief in Jewish law. They came with that, and now this wasn't mixing out so well. And unfortunately, they looked down on those Middle Easterners. They thought them, outdated. They thought that they were barbaric, and there was even what we would now recognize as racism, where the Ashkenazim would say, "I don't want my children to marry a Sephardic Jew. I don't want my children to marry a Mizrahi Jew." It was a problem, and that continued for quite some time, really all the way up until the 70s, before things began to fundamentally shift. It got better, but it still took a long time to break down this behavior. So yeah, it wasn't paradise. We had lots of our own problems. Israel, when it was founded, and if no one minds, I'm going to put the air conditioner on a little bit more. When Israel was founded, it was what we would now recognize as a socialist country, not communist. We talked a little bit, some of the kibbutzim, the collective farms, they were voluntary communist groups, but the country as a whole was more like what we would think of Sweden or Denmark or Norway, and even more than some of those countries today. So for example, by 1970, 70% of the population worked for or in connection to the government. That means on 70% of the people's paychecks, the money came from the government. That's a very high number. And so the government had a lot of the businesses, they had a lot of the factories, they controlled a lot of the industry of the entire nation. In the 80s, that began to change, right? But even still, Israel has a more socialist identity than America does, for example. So they have universal health care. They have support for the elderly, support for children or families with children, and many other forms of social welfare and safety net that reach beyond, in many cases, what we do in the United States. And that is, even though the big changes happened in the 80s, there is still this leftover idea that the country, the state, should care for everybody in the state. This was also reinforced, this idea of everybody together, of course, because everyone had to be together in the military. Israel has still a mandatory draft. Everybody, when they reach the age of 18, when they finish high school, has to serve in the military. The length of service has been adjusted up and down a little bit, depending upon the current situation. And that gives everybody a training, either in combat or in other ways, to support the country when it's needed. And that also has a very strong bonding experience for the country. Any questions on that? Yeah.
Yes, I have heard people who have their kids born here and they go to Israel
Yep.
to join the
Yes.
military there.
Yes. So if you're an Israeli citizen, even if you're living outside of the land of Israel, like if you're Israeli but you've moved to the US and your kids still have Israeli passports, it's not just they can, they must. If they are an Israeli citizen, they need to go into the military. So for example, if I were Israeli and I had an Israeli passport, which I don't, but if I did, when my daughter turns 18, she would have to report for duty. And when my son turned 18, he would have to report for duty. And if they didn't, then it would be a crime. We'd be breaking the law, even if we lived outside of the land. Now, if you're not from Israel and you want to make Aliyah, you want to become a citizen, then yes, you go. And if you're within a certain range of age, then when you get there, one of the first things you're going to do is do your service. You'll have to learn Hebrew first and get settled, but you're going to sign up and you're going to serve in the army because that's what it is to be an Israeli citizen. It's kind of the all hands on deck. Now, people like me who are, a little gray and old, if I were to go to Israel now, they wouldn't put me into any sort of combat thing. But
so if you, that what you said, because that's why now I understand better, because I know people who just born here, but they're not Israeli.
Right.
So they go there, they do the service.
Yes.
And when they do all that, then they get the Israeli citizenship?
Well, they're Israeli citizens to start. But if they go at a certain age, they will also have to serve in the military. And in fact, there are many people who do that. There's a whole system in Israel called the Lone Soldier Program, where children, they're 18. I don't want to think of them as children, but my daughter's getting close. So I keep thinking of that as being childlike. that when they go to make Aliyah, they go to volunteer in the military. Now, some of them go and they serve in the military, and then they come back to the US or France or Germany or Argentina or any other country they came from. And others will stay. In fact, we have one congregant who has had two of her daughters go and serve, and now they live in Israel full time.
Yes, and also I have seen the opposite side,
Mm-hmm.
that they had lived before they had to serve.
Yes.
And then somehow they stay in the States and they don't have to serve.
Because they don't go back. Right. So if you leave Israel, just as there is Aliyah, which means to go up to Israel, there is Yerida, which means to descend, to go down. And it's a very controversial topic. So if you are somebody and you want to leave Israel, maybe for a business opportunity or some other reason, you have to think very hard. When we leave, what's going to happen when our kids would need to go, or what about me? Because even if you finish your tour of duty, you still are a reservist, like being, in the National Guard or the Army Reserve in America. And that means every so often you have to go and do a few weeks worth of service for the military. And that can be very difficult for people who have left the country. But Israel is very strict on this, because if they didn't, then they wouldn't have enough people to fight. When you looked at the map that we did last time of all of the countries that were around Israel, all of those countries have anywhere from 3 to 8 times the population of Israel, which means that altogether their armies would be at least 10-fold larger than Israel. Sorry, just someone walking by. And that meant that Israel needs every person it can get. And if they start letting people not serve in the military, then it won't have a strong enough military to defend itself.
No, like she was saying, when somebody, doesn't want to do the service in
Mhm.
Israel, move over here.
Right.
And then when they get older, they want to go back to Israel. They will be penalized?
There will be penalties, yes.
Uh-huh.
Yes. You can't just wait here for 40 years and then go back. Israel keeps track. The government keeps count of all of the citizens who have been living abroad and neglecting their duty.
So what will be the penalty?
I'm not 100% sure on that. I've never met somebody who went through that kind of situation. But I know for a fact that there are some people who lived here and their parents were Israeli and they had Israeli passports and they went back to visit Israel when they were in their early 20s. And Israel said, "Welcome back. We'd like you to wear this uniform." And they went, "What?" And it was quite a big deal for them to get that all straightened out. But yeah, it's if you're a citizen, you serve. Okay.
Thank you.
Government. So Israel has what's known as the Knesset. That's their Congress, their parliament. There are 120 seats in the Knesset. And this has changed a lot over the time, but this is the current way. If you have the majority, so if you've got 61 seats, then whoever is the leader of your party becomes the prime minister. And Israel does also have a president, but the president is more symbolic. He has some actual duties, but mostly the prime minister is the person who's actually in charge of the government. However, for most of the recent years, no one party has had a majority, right? No one group gets 61 of the seats. In America, we're used to the idea of Republicans and Democrats and maybe a couple other things. But in Israel, no one gets close to being that level of majority. Instead, you have something like Likud, which is currently the largest party in Israel, which has 30 seats. So you can see the largest party has 30 seats out of 120, and that's a big one. So what do? Well, you take the 30 seats of Likud, you make a deal with Kulanu, which has 10, with Bayit Yehudi, with Shas, with United Torah Judaism, and Yisrael Beitenu, and together you make it over that margin, and now you've got a government. That's what we call a coalition in Israel. Now, this is good because it pulls in lots of groups, lots of opinions, and you have to make compromises and deals. It's also bad because it pulls in lots of groups, lots of opinions, and you have to make lots of compromises. So, for example, Likud may have a policy that they want to push forward, but if one of these other groups says we don't like that policy, then Likud can't make it happen. And similarly, if one of these groups has something they really, really want, money for their pet project, they can tell Likud, pay up or we leave, right? We will pull out of the coalition. So this creates a lot of politics in Israel daily, because you can change this. This can fall apart any day, and when it falls apart, you get a new election. And as a matter of fact, that's what Israel is going through right now. There's going to be a new election in the beginning of April, and all of these numbers are going to change. And we'll see who will be the largest party. There's another party right now that's not on the list that is giving Likud a good run of maybe being able to pass it. But we won't know until the beginning of April. And then when that party passes it, which at the moment it's got like maybe 34 to 36 seats, if they pass, they still don't have 61, which means they're going to have to find other people to make deals with as well. So there's definitely going to be a coalition in the near future. So stay tuned for that exciting news in April. If you like politics, Israeli politics is a never-ending source of interesting news. For example, today, the current leader of Likud, which means the current prime minister, known as Benjamin Netanyahu, was just indicted on a fairly severe list of corruption charges and bribery. So he may not even make it to April. He said he's not stepping down because he thinks that this is all just fake, but we'll see. You never know. Every day, something new.
Excuse me.
Yes.
Is this are these 120 seats filled out similar like the House of Reps, where you have just like districts and regions?
No, it's proportional representation. Thank you. That's a really important distinction between the American system and the Israeli system. So if you get 40% of the vote in the country, you get 40% of the 120 seats, more or less. There is a threshold of, I think they raised it up to like 3.5%, that if you don't get at least 3.5%, you get nothing. And then they distribute those seats with the remaining people who got above that threshold. But there are no districts in Israel for the national politics. I mean, Israel itself as a state is about the size of New Jersey. So the districts would be tiny. And Israel thought that a proportional system was better able to reflect the diverse population scattered around the country, rather than the pockets that might exist. So yes, it's entirely proportional. That means that of the 120 seats in the last election, I believe the United ticket, the United Party for the Arab groups, got about 20 or more seats. They were, I think, the third or fourth largest party in the last election. And that works because of proportional representation. If it was district-based, there would be only a few areas where the Arabs command a majority that would be able to put their candidate into the Knesset. But because of the proportional, it means that even though they're a small minority of the population, they can still have members in the parliament.
So people are voting on the individual parties and not individuals?
Exactly. The party puts out what's called a list. And at the top of the list is who they would have as their prime minister. And then they just make a list that goes down 120 slots. And if they get 50% of the vote, then their top 60 people get seats. If they get 100% of the vote, which can't happen, but if they did, then all 120 would get to go to the Knesset. So you're voting exactly for a party rather than for a person, but you do know who will be prime minister if your party wins. So it's the personality does still matter. Of course, the other important jobs, the other cabinet posts, those are negotiated as part of your coalition. So, you may have one party that wants the health ministry, another party that wants to be in charge of the military, another one that wants to be in charge of education, and they all have to make the deals of who's going to have which minister be in charge of which department. And that gets really, really bloody. Okay. Unfortunately, a lot of Israeli history over 1948 till the modern time can be marked by the different wars. So 1956 was the first major engagement since 1948. But I should point out that Egypt had been attacking Israel on a low scale, a low grade aggression ever since the end of 1948's independence war. So although there was an official ceasefire and most of the tanks went home and the planes stopped flying and things like that, people would still go across the border and attack Israeli farms, or they would shoot across the border, and this continued all the way up until 1967 into the Six-Day War, which we'll get to in a second. So by 1956, Israel is in a position where they have been dealing with these armed groups that come across from Egypt. Nasser, who was the leader of Egypt, the dictator at the time, had nationalized the Suez Canal. And the Suez Canal was rather important because the Suez Canal is the link between the Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean. And that had been under British control ever since they dug it when they conquered Egypt back in the 1800s. So England had been in control of the Suez Canal, and now even when they gave Egypt independence, they were still in control. And now Nasser has taken it away from the British, saying, this is our country, so maybe we should be in charge of that long, ditch. England and France were both very unhappy with this. They were both very concerned about the state of their colonies in 1956, still trying to hold on to their empire status. And so according to many of the historical documents, they encouraged Israel to fight back against Egypt. And then the idea was England and France would come in and say, whoa, let's stop this war. Here, how about if we just hold on to this canal for a little bit longer in order to make things die down? At this time, Israel was almost 100% dependent on British and French arms, and Israel went along with the plan. But as I said, they were being attacked. They were now no longer able to use the Suez Canal, which was a huge economic problem. And they were seeing the buildup of the Egyptian military that was happening. Nasser was a very interesting person, and his vision was to create a united Arab coalition, really a mega Arab state that would be able to take over Israel as a unified whole. We talked a little bit last week about how in 1948, one of the reasons the Arab armies lost was because they were not working as a unified force. Each one had their own objective, and none of them were coordinated very well with the others. So he was trying to avoid that in the future. Israel has quick gains. Unfortunately, both the British, the French, and Israel misjudged the American reaction. The belief was that since 1956 was an election year, that President Eisenhower would not be that interested in what was going on in the Middle East. But instead, Eisenhower was, and America flexed its muscle, and Israel retreated back to the borders that it was at, and the canal stayed in possession of Egypt, but it was opened up again. So there was some gain from this. Unfortunately, the attacks continued, but not only from Egypt, but also very dramatically from Golan. The Golan Heights are in northern Israel, up above the Sea of Galilee, known as Yam Kinneret, the Lake Kinneret, and it is approximately a couple thousand feet higher than the area that was Israel proper. Now, that's lovely and gives you breathtaking views if you go and visit there today, but if you are standing up here and you have weapons, you can fire mortars perfectly into the entire farmland and upper population centers of Israel. And this is what was happening from Syria. They were firing just bombs right into Israel. You don't need planes to do this because you're already high enough that your mortars will go very, very far. And Israel was rather upset about this situation. At the same time, in 1967, at this point in summer, the Arab forces were beginning to bring their tanks up towards the borders. They were beginning to arm and get ready for war. They had also ordered the United Nations troops that were in the Sinai Peninsula between Egypt and Israel to leave, and the United Nations troops did. This is one reason why Israel has been reluctant to trust UN peacekeepers in the future, because the last time, well, not quite the last time, but one of the most prominent times when the UN peacekeepers were supposed to separate Israel from its enemies, when they were told to leave by our enemies, they did. Which, if you're able to tell the police, go away, it doesn't really make you rely on the police very much. And so that was seen as being a step towards full war. They also closed the Straits of Tiran, that's in the Persian Gulf. At this time, Israel was getting most of its oil from Iran, which was still an American puppet state under the Shah in the 1960s, after we had gotten rid of their democratically elected government back in the 50s, which was probably a mistake in hindsight. But we're not here to discuss Iranian history. But at the time, that meant that Israel was now going to be strangled for oil, because Israel did not have much oil of its own. Jordan and Iraq were also putting together a defense pact, and that meant Israel felt it needed to attack. And so what did Israel do? It attacked first. Well, attacked first. Like I said, there were bombs coming from Golan, there were raiders coming from Egypt, there was an embargo of oil. All of those are considered acts of war under international law, but no one else had declared war yet. And so Israel is often accused of a preemptive strike. Really, this was a retaliatory strike for all of the provocation, but it was very well timed, which is why we call this the Six-Day War, because Israel was able to destroy all of the air forces of these other armies on the ground. They just bombed them on the runways and were then able to use their commanding air superiority to destroy the tanks and other troops. And that meant that Israel went from being this to being all of this. Wow. The Israeli armies was able to come all the way up to the Suez Canal, and there was nothing stopping it from going straight into Cairo. Israel went all the way up to the Jordan River, and there was nothing that prevented it from going to Amman, the capital of Jordan. Same way in Golan, Israel went up onto those heights and could have driven straight into Damascus. But Israel didn't. Israel stopped where the shaded stops and said, okay, we've got what we've got. Now, this was partly because the international community was alarmed at what Israel had accomplished, but also because Israel had achieved its objectives. It had pushed back the borders away from its major population centers and had given itself what is often referred to as strategic depth. That's the favorite trick of Russia in history, which means that if an army attacks, you can retreat a little, and then you can punch back. If there's nowhere to retreat, it makes it much harder to punch back when you get attacked. This was strategic depth for Israel on its small scale, but by its small scale, it made a big difference. Its overall size was tripled. It now controlled what we call Gaza, this area here, the Sinai Peninsula, the West Bank, and Golan Heights. It also captured East Jerusalem. That is the part that had been taken by Jordan in 1948. And that part included the old city of Jerusalem, the more famous part of Jerusalem that people see on the postcards. Mm-hmm. In this big push, it also meant that Israel now was in charge of an additional 750,000 Arab people. The people who lived in Gaza and who lived in the West Bank, and the people who lived up in the Golan Heights. Israel was now in charge of them, what is now usually referred to as occupation. Like I said, those areas had been occupied by Syria, by Jordan, and by Egypt prior to 1967. The international community did not really complain, but Israel occupies them in 67, and now people begin to complain about the occupation until this very day. How are we doing? Okay? Okay. So even though the war's over, the acts do continue afterwards. The attacks are much weaker and not as strong, but it's not like everybody just goes back and has peace. 1973, the Yom Kippur War. So not very much longer, the Arab states decided to launch an additional full-scale attack. The day they chose to attack was Yom Kippur, for obvious reasons. Now, it's obvious to us because, of course, it's the day when everybody is, in prayer and in synagogue, because even if you're secular, that's a day you're probably going to be going to services. But even worse, the Arab army had been raising their alert levels and then backing off, bringing their tanks up and then backing off multiple times in the months and days leading up to Yom Kippur. And this was sort of the equivalent of the boy who cries wolf. They were trying to show Israel, we could attack you, we could attack you, we could attack you, but it's a fake out, but it's a fake out, but now it's real. And they did it for real on Yom Kippur. Israel almost lost this war. Israel was almost destroyed in this attack. During the first few days, Israel was pushed back very, very hard, partly because there was new Soviet technology that was being used by the Arab armies that Israel had not learned how to counter yet. They would by the end of this war. And in the early days, there was really no international support. Eventually, however, Israel figures out how to counter the new surface-to-air missile systems and other tactics that are being used, and is able to push back all the way to the borders that they had captured in 1967. So they lose no territory during this war. This is the last full-scale conventional war that has been fought by Israel. The wars that come after this are what we would now call asymmetrical wars, where Israel is not fighting against full armies, but fighting against armed militias and terrorist groups, which have a very different set of tactics. Following Yom Kippur, something else happened, which was not only the wound to Israel's pride militarily, but also Israel now had huge costs. They had suffered inflation, the same way many other countries did in the 1970s. I don't know if people here remember that, or at least remember from history books. But the 70s were the era of hyperinflation. And the Labor Party, which had been in charge of Israel since 1948, lost. And they lost the Likud. And this made huge changes. Likud was much more about free market economies. And so the policies they brought in privatized most of the government companies and operations. Currency trading for the shekel was liberalized, so there was more flexibility there. And not as government policy, but you did see as an outgrowth of all of this, a huge beginning to the tech boom that continues really to this day. There's a great book called Startup Nation that details how Israel came to be such a dominant force in the world of technology and information technology. In the late 70s, we get the first real overture of peace. It's what's known as the Camp David Accords. This was under President Jimmy Carter's watch, and the Egyptian president, Anwar Sadat, and the Israeli Prime Minister, Menachem Begin, two people that you would not have picked as being the people to make peace. Both of them were quite aggressive, both of them were quite militant, but both of them came together and they signed a deal in 1978. In that deal, Israel gave back the Sinai Peninsula to Egypt in exchange for peace, not just a ceasefire, but an actual peace treaty, and the recognition that Israel had the right to exist. So Israel gave up that huge chunk of territory and all of its strategic depth for really that promise. A lot of people thought Menachem Begin was crazy for doing that, but that promise has continued to hold until this day. And Egypt was the largest army in the area, and so taking Egypt out of the war meant that Israel really could now breathe a little bit more comfortably when dealing with challenges from other actors. And it also meant that almost none of the other states now wanted to go to war against Israel without Egypt having that other side of the country to attack from. So this changed everything for Israel from that point forward. One part of the deal also talked about giving statehood to the Palestinians. This is sort of the official third opportunity that the Palestinians had to hopefully have a state. Unfortunately, they rejected the accords because they said they were not involved in the initial discussion, and so they wanted no part of it at all. And that meant that the opportunity to establish a Palestinian state in the late 70s was lost. Anwar Sadat was murdered because of this. Many people in his own country were very unhappy about his decision to do this, and so he was assassinated. Mubarak came in afterwards and maintained the peace deal, which was quite a relief to everyone involved. And all the way up until this day, as I said, Egypt has maintained that peace deal. One of the reasons why Egypt maintains that peace deal is not only because it's good for them, but because it is lucrative for them. Egypt receives on the order of, I haven't checked recently, but on the order of about $2 to $3 billion a year in government money from the United States. That was our way of encouraging them to develop without being aggressors towards Israel. And that has made a big difference. So if you ever wonder where that foreign aid goes in the American money, a large chunk of it goes a bit to Egypt. Another large chunk of it goes to Israel, partly to keep Israel able to have a military edge, so that despite being small, it is able to punch above its weight class. Okay, looking at the clock. But even though the conventional war was much less of a threat, from the mid-60s on, the threat of terrorism had been growing. The PLO, known as the Palestinian Liberation Organization, which began as a secular nationalist movement for Palestinian statehood, was created by the Arab League in 1964. Notice the date. Many people associate terrorism with Israeli occupation of the West Bank and Gaza Strip. This happened 3 years before Israel would come into possession of the West Bank and Gaza Strip. The idea here was not that Israel should not be in control of the West Bank or Gaza. The idea here was that Israel should not be in control of Israel, that there should not be an Israel. The Palestinian national organizations have all focused, really until the modern day, on the idea that everybody in Israel should either leave or stop having their own government and let the Palestinians be in charge. The idea that there would be a two-state solution is a very, very recent thing that some Palestinians have accepted, and hopefully will be the building stones for a peace process to actually go forward. But that was not the initial intent. Yasser Arafat, who was the leader of the organization, organized 61 attacks just between September through December of 1967. Their first hijacking of an airplane was in 1968. And the PLO continued to commit acts of terror against civilian targets all the way up until the Camp David Accords with Bill Clinton in the 1990s. That was their method of challenging Israel and its position within the Middle Eastern geography. Hezbollah is another group. They are formed out of the Lebanon War in 1985. And Hamas is a group that operates today mostly out of the Gaza Strip, and they were formed in 1987. But Lebanon is a very interesting situation. So Lebanon is the country to the north of Israel along the Mediterranean coast, sort of nestled in a crook of Syria. Lebanon had been a very successful country for most of the middle of the 20th century. It was under French rule and occupation, but eventually became independent. It was often considered the Riviera of the Eastern Mediterranean. It was a very mixed ethnic group, meaning that there were Christians and Muslims within the country, and it had something like a stable democracy. Well, 1970, the PLO was housed mostly in Jordan, and they decided that the Jordanian king was not doing enough. And since there were so many refugees from Palestine in Jordan, they decided to have a revolution and try to get rid of the Jordanian king. The Jordanian king did not like this, and the Jordanian king won after brutal and horrible crackdown against the PLO and the murder of thousands of people on the Palestinian side. And they were kicked out of Jordan. That is to say, the PLO as an organization was completely removed from the country. They relocated to Lebanon, because that's just to the north and also on the border with Israel. And they began to attack from there. And in 1975, were partly responsible for creating the civil war that tore Lebanon apart. And during that civil war, there was now less of a stable government to hold the PLO back. And so the PLO began to attack Israel more and more and more from this northern border. So then in 1978, Israel invades just Lebanon. It goes across the border to try and stop. In 1982, after the invasion had stabilized the south, in 1982 things flare up again. Israel goes even further into Lebanon, all the way up to striking in Beirut, because that's where the main offices of the PLO were. A PLO eventually flees from Lebanon and moves to Tunisia, and Israel attacks them there as well, but it's much harder because that's all the way across much of the Mediterranean. Israel finally gets out of southern Lebanon in the year 2000. I don't know if you remember or have seen history books or news clips, but the US was trying to help stabilize the situation when, under Ronald Reagan, we sent Marines to try and reinforce Lebanon to keep it from falling apart into complete and utter chaos. And that led to a terrorist bombing of the Marine barracks, which killed hundreds of American soldiers at that time. And then the US left, because the US population was not willing to lose those kinds of casualties in order to bring peace to that region. So Israel stays until 2000 in order to try and calm things down, because, as I mentioned, this new terrorist group known as Hezbollah begins to attack Israel in southern Lebanon, and Israel would rather that they fight them in Lebanon than they fight them in Israel. And so for the next 10, 12 years, Israel is occupying this area of southern Lebanon, and eventually in 2000, they unilaterally withdraw to the border. This has created less occupational stress, but it does mean that Israel now faces tens of thousands of rockets that are aimed at it and that routinely fly across the border from Lebanon into Israel by Hezbollah. So Israel is still trying not to, but they have had to go back into Lebanon a few times since 2000 in order to try and take out these rocket launchers and other attacks. It's not peaceful yet, is what I'm trying to say. And unfortunately, Lebanon is still in pieces. The civil war in Syria did not help. That has destabilized Lebanon just as it looked like it might be getting itself back together again. So we hope that eventually they will be able to resume a peaceful life and be able to keep their own non-government militias, which Hezbollah is not actually part of the government, keep them from acting in these ways. Okay. Innovation nation. Let's talk about good stuff. Because Israel, despite having all of these war concerns, is still second in the world for the percent of population with college degrees. As I mentioned, its software took off in the 1980s. It is a leader in agricultural, military, medical, robotic, and computer innovation. And it just launched a rocket from Florida to send a probe to the moon. If it works, because there's a little bit of a question on some of its technology, some of the things didn't fire quite right, but if it does get there, it'll be the fourth country to land something on the moon after the US, Russia, and China. Israel is usually in the top 2 or 3 countries that file patents in the US, and it ranks 10 in the Bloomberg Innovation Report of 2017, ahead of UK, China, Canada, France, and Norway. So Israel does have a lot going for it in terms of its domestic business sector. And I like to imagine that without the external threats and without the issues that it's plagued by, it would probably be doing even better. And hopefully we'll be able to have peace soon. Unfortunately, back on the bad stuff, locally, there began to become waves of terrorism that were orchestrated by the PLO that we now call the Intifada, these uprisings. The first Intifada was 1987 to 1991, or 93, depending upon how you want to count the attacks. These waves of violence and disruptions were targeted against civilians, and it was said that this was due to the frustration of the situation. By the late 80s, the other Arab countries did not really seem to have the stomach for fighting Israel directly, and although they were willing to give money and weapons to terrorist groups, they were not willing to commit full armies to fight against Israel. That meant the Palestinians were beginning to see that Israel was not going to be defeated by these other nations. So they decided to take matters into their own hand and use terrorism to try to force Israel to give in, or force other countries to force Israel to give in. That is why a lot of terrorism in the 80s and 90s was directed at Europe or American interests as a lever to make us or Europe force Israel to give the Palestinians what they want. And that is what led to many of the horrible crimes of those decades. The large number of non-uniformed casualties elicited a lot of sympathy. What I mean by non-uniform casualties are if somebody is wearing regular clothes and throws a grenade and then they get shot, they don't look like a soldier. If somebody is in a house and they shoot as a sniper across into an Israeli area, and then Israel shoots back and hits other people who live in that house, in addition to the person with the gun, those other people who are killed look like innocent bystanders. And this creates a very real tension for Israel of how to fight back against people for whom, when there are casualties, they gain more press and more sympathy. How do you stop people who are actually murderers without hurting innocent people who you don't want to hurt and who will actually hurt you diplomatically if they are hurt? There is no perfect solution to this yet, and Israel struggles with this with every engagement. And unfortunately, these violent interactions also disrupted what had begun to be a growing sense of trust. In the mid-'80s and early '90s, there were many Palestinians who came across from the West Bank and Gaza and who worked in Israel. They were people that came in as almost like immigrant labor, and they came across the border through the checkpoints. They would work at a factory, they would work in a farm, they would work at someone's house, and then they would go back across into the West Bank or Gaza in the evening. And this was creating a relationship, it was creating an economy, it was creating a bit of trust between people. This terrorism shattered all of that because now Israel was clamping down on those checkpoints. It was not letting as many people through, and Israel began to look elsewhere if it needed additional labor and began to give visas to people who wanted to come from Thailand, from the Philippines, or other places in the world that did not pose the same security risk. And that, of course, further hurt the economy of the Palestinian territories. In the 1990s, Yitzhak Rabin and Yasser Arafat got together under Bill Clinton to sign what is known as the Oslo Accords. That's Oslo, Norway, which is where they were signed. This was meant to be a framework for peace. The Palestinians said they would come to recognize Israel's right to exist, and Israel would recognize the Palestinian legitimate political rights. It would include a phased withdrawal of Israeli forces from Palestinian territory, that is to say the West Bank and Gaza Strip, and it would help set up a Palestinian government. They had an election. Yasser Arafat won. They haven't had an election since. That's not true, sorry. They had a second election in Gaza, and that's when Hamas won. But when they come to power, they don't really seem interested in having more democratic elections. But this was the beginning of an opportunity to really create a two-state solution. But unfortunately, it fell apart. And it fell apart. Sorry, I should point out that when it was first being brought up, there's an old piece of text. When Oslo was first being put up, the idea was to create this phased withdrawal. Unfortunately, as the technology continued to advance, Israel came under rocket threat, which was very different than just rifle threat. So rifle threats, you pretty much had to be along the border of the West Bank or Gaza to be under threat. But with the rockets began to be able to reach all the way into the heartland. And so Israel became more and more reluctant to let go of territory and that security supervision without greater and greater assurances. This didn't work out so well. Israel did in '94 sign a Jordanian peace, which was very important. It included water rights, it included defense cooperation, and most importantly for modern times, it included that Jordan would continue its, quote, historic role in administering Muslim sites in Jerusalem. So this means that the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque, the most famous sites on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem above the Western Wall, those are administrated by Jordanians, what's known as the Waqf. That's their religious committee that handles those sites. Israel was willing to allow them to continue that role. And even in 1967, when they took East Jerusalem and the Old City, Israel did not disturb any of the holy sites of the Muslims or of the Christians, for that matter. And that continues to this day, causing tensions, but mostly working out all right. Second Intifada. Unfortunately, Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated by an Israeli, by a Jewish man, who felt that he had betrayed his country, much the same way that Sadat was assassinated by a Muslim who felt that he had betrayed his country. Now we saw a stall of the peace process from both sides. And so in 2000, it's not surprising that after trying to get another peace agreement going at Camp David, that there was another instigation. The particular spark, but not the cause, was Ariel Sharon visiting the Temple Mount, which the Palestinians interpreted as being Jewish declaration of sovereignty over that area. It wasn't. It was just a publicity stunt for an Israeli politician, but it was a good excuse. In fact, it was the same excuse that was used for the massacres in Hebron back in 1929. So this was a repeat excuse of, if you want to get people angry, tell them the Jews are trying to take over the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Unfortunately, this violence really tore apart what had begun to grow with the Oslo Accords, and it set back the cause of peace, well, till now. What had been growing even with Yitzhak Rabin's assassination was almost completely stopped at this point. So what's left to figure out? How can we get to peace? Well, Israel asks that it be recognized as a Jewish state. This is not about demanding them to recognize Israel as a religious entity. This is about the Palestinians giving up the idea of the right of return. The Palestinians at the moment have, as part of their negotiating portfolio, a demand that any Palestinian or descendant of any Palestinian who left the borders of Israel, that is to say the original 1948 borders, should be allowed to return to their original house and residence and become citizens. At the moment, that would mean anywhere from 4 to 6 million people coming into the land of Israel who were not Israeli a day before. Israel has said, no, this is not something we're willing to entertain as an option, partly because if you did that, the Jewish population would be completely overwhelmed and Israel would no longer have its unique character as the only state in the world where Jews are guaranteed a welcome at all times. And so when Israel says it wants to be recognized as a Jewish state, what they're actually saying is the Palestinians have to give up the dream of having these millions of people come back in to the 1948 borders of Israel. There is still the argument of who controls Jerusalem, both East Jerusalem as well as the Old City. There is still issue of the Israelis who are living over the Green Line. You've probably heard about the settlements. Now, many of these settlements are in fact suburbs of Jerusalem, and they're not settlements like, a tent. They are settlements in the sense of large apartment blocks. Most everybody agrees from past negotiations that didn't quite make it, but had gotten quite far, that those large suburban blocks will probably be brought into Israel, and there will be land that will be swapped to the Palestinians to exchange for, these acres and you get those acres, so that they won't lose the amount of territory, they'll just lose that particular segment of territory. Exactly how much sovereignty and autonomy will the Palestinians have is also open for much debate. Will they be allowed to have an army? Will they be allowed to have an air force? Will Israel be allowed to patrol the Jordanian border? Will they be allowed to patrol the Egyptian border in order to stop terrorists from infiltrating into Palestinian state and then use that as a launching pad for attacks? The same way that Hezbollah may not be sanctioned by Lebanon, but they are able to operate out of Lebanon. Israel doesn't really want to have something like that happen in the Palestinian territories as well. So even if they made peace with the Palestinians, it could still turn into a real problem if there aren't enough security assurances. And good, I think we're done. So that's where we sit. But like I said, the real hot news for this week is the upcoming election. And it is a blessing that Israel has a democracy. It doesn't always feel like a blessing as it goes through the bloodbath of its political cycle. The one real beautiful thing that they have as an advantage over us is whenever they end up having an election, it goes from declaring an election, 3 months later the election happens, and then it's done. So they have a three-month election cycle every 5 years at most, and it is more merciful to do it that fast and quick. It's just like ripping off a Band-Aid. So we will see in April what the future holds for the Israel part of all of this equation. But hopefully it will be something that can move forward with peace, and hopefully we'll find people on the other side who are willing to reciprocate. Thank you.
Thank you.
And hopefully the